Thanks so much. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share some of my work with you. As Professor Chow mentioned, I am interested in why we have the public policies that we do. And for me to ask that question, why do we have these public policies, it points towards politics and towards political science as a way to study which policies we have and why. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Center for Effective Lawmaking, which I direct. The research that's coming out of that center, our Building a Better Congress project, and then I'll be sure to leave most of the time for questions and discussion. So the Center for Effective Lawmaking is something that I founded a little more than 5 years ago. It is a partnership between the University of Virginia, the Batten School at UVA, and Vanderbilt University. And when we set this up with my co-director at Vanderbilt, we articulated the vision that we had of what we would hope the world would look like down the road. And so we envision a Congress comprised of effective lawmakers, strong institutional capacity, and the incentive structure needed to address America's greatest public policy challenges. But for any of you who are aware of the Congress we actually have, we're not there yet. And as such, our center was set up with a particular mission, and that mission is to advance the generation, communication, and use of new knowledge about the effectiveness of individual lawmakers and US legislative institutions. In other words, we think that some members of Congress are more effective as lawmakers than are others, and we'd like to know why. We'd like to study that systematically and hopefully offer some advice that's communicated and used to, in some ways, build a better Congress. This idea that some members of Congress are more effective than others is not a new idea. We like to point back to Speaker Sam Rayburn, who was a longstanding Speaker of the House of Representatives in Congress around the time of World War II, who colorfully identified different types of lawmakers. He said, any jackass can kick down a barn, but it takes a good carpenter to build one. And from that point of view, I firmly believe that American democracy would benefit from more skilled carpenters trying to assemble solutions to public policy challenges than from more of this other kind of lawmaker and politician that we might say that we have too many of. So what we try to do at the center then is to use a social scientific approach that's going to take us 2 steps down the road. The first step is that we'd like to find some way to systematically measure who are the effective lawmakers and less effective lawmakers in Congress. And the second step is that we'd love to do something with those data to help us understand how to maybe get more of the good carpenters into Congress. So the first step there is, how do we identify who's a good carpenter or who's an effective lawmaker? And here we tried a variety of methods before ultimately we settled on combining 15 different elements into a legislative effectiveness score for each member of Congress. And what we do there then is look at the bills that members sponsor, how far they move through the lawmaking process, and how important they are. And so in particular, for each member of the House and each member of the Senate in each 2-year Congress, we're able to count up how many bills do they introduce. But then we track each of those often 5,000 to 10,000 bills through the lawmaking process. How many of their bills received action in committee, so a hearing or a markup or a subcommittee vote? How many of them received action beyond committee, so they made it to the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate? How many of them passed their home chamber, and how many of them ultimately became law? But we also know that not every policy, not every bill is the same, and so we didn't want to weight all of them equally. What we did was we said we should upgrade in our score the substantive and significant bills, the big issues of the day, the ones that get written up in the major newspapers, and we should downgrade the commemoratives. Somebody passing a renaming of a post office shouldn't get the same score as someone who's able to help reform Social Security. And then our middle category are substantive issues, but not the biggest issues of the day. So we have 3 categories of bill significance, 5 stages of the lawmaking process, 3 times 5, that's 15 metrics that we combine together into a weighted average. So these later stages and more important issues are giving someone a much, much higher legislative effectiveness score. We've done this for every member of the House of Representatives, every senator, for every Congress from the mid-1970s up through today. And so that gives us tons and tons of data, and we can use those data to say, what is it about some members that makes them more effective than others, and how can we use that to build a better Congress? So our research agenda here is what we call the Building a Better Congress project, and it has three main parts. The first part is what we refer to as identification. Are there some individuals or individuals who have particular traits or characteristics that if they were to choose to run for Congress and were elected to Congress would likely be highly effective once they get there? Our second bucket is what we refer to as cultivation. Now that someone is actually in Congress, what could they do as an individual to be more effective? What habits could they develop? What actions could they take? Simultaneously, how could we potentially have some reforms in Congress that would help the institution as a whole address public policy challenges more fruitfully? And the third is what we refer to as accountability. Do voters hold accountable particular members of Congress, voting out those who are ineffective and supporting re-electing those who are effective? Do campaign contributors care about this? How does that accountability cycle actually play out? And so I'll introduce very briefly a few of the research projects in each of these three buckets before going back and opening it up for questions. Our first being identification. And one might imagine that being a person who enters Congress after serving in the US state legislatures, that might help. That's on-the-job experience. They already have some legislative experience. And what our research shows is that about half of all members of Congress have had some experience in the state legislatures, but those experiences vary dramatically. So in some states, like out in California or Pennsylvania or Michigan, New York is like this, they are what we would refer to as professional legislatures. They meet year-round, they pay their legislators enough that that's their full-time job, and they have legislative staff to help them move their bills through the lawmaking process. They look like Congress. But in other states, like we have here in Virginia, we have what's referred to as a citizen legislature. They don't meet year-round. They meet for a couple months, sometimes in some states, a couple months every other year. They don't pay their legislators enough. They have to have another job. And they don't really have a lot of staff to help move legislation through the process. And what we've found is that people who serve in the professional state legislatures, and particularly if they do a great job there, because now we've scored state legislators as well on their effectiveness, once they get to Congress, they really hit the ground running and they're truly effective. They've shown that they can excel in a job that's very much like their current job. But we don't find any such correlation for people who have served in citizen legislatures. And in fact, on average, people who serve in citizen legislatures tend to be a little less effective than people who didn't serve in state legislators at all once they get up to Congress. In essence, when we talk to them and we hear about their experiences, they're drawing the wrong lessons. They're taking lessons from their citizen legislature and hoping that they apply in Congress where they don't in many cases. So that doesn't work out so well. So one goal, potentially, to build a better Congress is to think about, can we have more professional state legislatures, and can we have legislators gaining their experience there, moving on up to Congress? And on that front, I'll use the word unfortunately, and I'm going to use this a lot today. Unfortunately, there are far more citizen legislatures than professional state legislatures in the US, so not great training grounds right now. A second finding in this identification category is that all else equal, we find that women are much more effective than our men in Congress. And when we really drill down, we find that this takes place mainly within the minority party. That when moving from the majority party to the minority party, women tend to still put forward as many bills as they were previously, reach across party lines, try to build coalitions, try to move their ideas forward. Not all women, but that's the average pattern. Men, on average, again, not all of them, but more so than women, when they move from the majority party to the minority party, tend to be more obstruction. Let's stop what the majority party is doing. Let's not work with them. Let's not even put forward bills in many cases. And that difference is really stark and remarkable. So another way to build a better Congress is to have more women run for Congress. Might think about that down the road, but using that word again, unfortunately, about 1/4 of all members of the House and 1/4 of all members of the Senate are women at present. So there's a lot of work to be done there. So if we're thinking about building a better Congress, we can do that through the identification category. We can also do that through the cultivation category. What can members do once they've arrived in Congress to be highly effective? One of our initial findings is that if you want to be able to do a good job, you should surround yourself with people who know how to do that job. And for members of Congress, that's hiring experienced staffers, people who have served as legislative staff already for other members on Capitol Hill. When you're a new member, you get to hire whomever you want. Again, unfortunately, we find that about half of all new members of Congress hire an entire legislative staff with either 0 years of Capitol Hill experience or collectively 2 years, up to 2 years of Capitol Hill experience. And for those who find staff with 10 or more years of experience, they essentially come in looking like the members that we find who have already been on Capitol Hill for 6 to 8 years, that they can build on that expertise from their staff. Another strategy that people could take is to engage in bipartisanship. And by this, we mean when one puts forward a piece of legislation, you can have co-sponsors attached to it. You can reach out to members of your own party and only look to them for co-sponsorship, or you can reach across party lines. And what we find is that the members who basically don't introduce anything until they already have lined up at least one co-sponsorship from each party are much more effective than those who dedicate most of their efforts to growing out the coalition within their own parties. And so lots of evidence that your ideal level of bipartisanship on your co-sponsorships is around 40 to 50% of everybody should be from the other party. So you should treat all members of Congress alike if you want to build that coalition and get things done. And it used to be that Congress looked like that. But again, the word unfortunately, over time, Congress has become less bipartisan. Now, it's not non-existent. On average, about 20 to 30% of co-sponsorships are now across party lines. But it's not the 40 to 50% level that's associated with the high level of effectiveness of lawmakers. Another possibility, and the one that you read about in the assignment for today, is this idea of expertise or specialization. That idea that we expressed as, do you want to be a fox or a hedgehog? The fox tries to do a variety of things and can do a variety of things well. The hedgehog basically does one thing. They're awfully cute, but they're also protecting themselves, and they do that very well. And what we were exploring here is across a bunch of different issue areas, about 20 different issue areas, who are the members of Congress that put forward ideas in all 20 of them, and who are the ones that dedicate half or more of their efforts to one policy area and specialize. And what we found is that those who specialize, and the ideal is about 50% of your agenda to one issue where you're the expert, you're the specialist, and then some to 2 or 3 other issue areas that they're much more effective as lawmakers. Unfortunately, that level of specialization has been declining in Congress as members are finding that the expertise that they were previously building up within their committees and subcommittees doesn't seem to be as much something that they feel internally that they're able to work through. In other words, a lot more of the most high-profile bills are coming from the party leadership rather than from the committee process. So when we think about the committee process and how that plays out, one more way to think about what's going on there is it takes a while to build up that expertise. And we find that it takes a while to build up that expertise not only for the members, what we call the rank and file members of Congress, but also for the committee chairs and the subcommittee chairs. Whenever you're leading something, it takes a while for you to figure out, well, how am I going to be a really good leader as a committee chair to get a lot done? How am I going to be a really good leader as a subcommittee chair and get a lot done? And what we find is that for those individual lawmakers as committee chairs and subcommittee chairs, but also for the work of their committees and subcommittees as a whole, it helps to have more experience. So They really start reaching their stride once they've served about 4 terms or so as committee chair. One thing that we say is unfortunate is that as of the mid-1990s, Congress put term limits on their committee chairs. So right about the time that they get a sense of how to run their committees and how to actually get a lot done through their committees, they're term limited out and somebody new comes in. This is in the cultivation space, but as an institution as a whole. So unfortunately, it doesn't seem like Congress is moving in the direction either in our identification bucket or our cultivation bucket. And so our third hope is what we refer to as accountability. Maybe voters will come to the rescue. Maybe voters will inform themselves about how effective their lawmakers are, and they'll re-elect those effective lawmakers, and they'll vote out the ineffective lawmakers. And here what we did was a number of survey experiments where we would take about half of the respondents and not tell them anything about how effective their lawmakers are, and the other half we would tell them how effective their lawmakers are. And the ones that we informed cared about it dramatically. They really didn't like ineffective lawmakers. They really liked effective lawmakers. They were much more willing to vote for those effective lawmakers rather than the ineffective members of Congress. But that was us giving them that information. And most of the time, most voters are really uninformed about how effective their lawmakers are, such that when we looked not in our survey experiments, but at the actual observational data, we found this flat line. How effective somebody was in the previous Congress is totally unrelated to the vote share in bringing them back to Congress. So building a better Congress, we have a lot of research ideas, but they haven't been successful. We've been using that unfortunate word quite a bit. And as such, the Center for Effective Lawmaking is interested not just in doing research, but then communicating that and hopefully getting it into use. And so in my last few minutes of this portion, I want to tell you about some of that engagement work. So first, in the identification space, we've been working with a variety of organizations that promote more women running for Congress, or more veterans running for Congress, or the Sorensen Institute here at UVA that helps with training young leaders who might end up running for various political offices. And so giving them the information about how they can be successful, or for example, that although it's a tough road, we need more women in Congress because they are more effective and they're representing people better in a variety of fronts. That helps resonate and helps advance these organizations and their activities. In terms of our cultivation bucket for any new member of Congress, we provide them and their staff with a guide to how to be an effective lawmaker. We do a variety of training sessions. We help them make those key choices about what bills to put forward, in what areas, don't get too scattered, hire those experienced staffers, and so on. We've also been in a position where we've been able to make some recommendations to what exists currently, which is the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. Based on our research, for example, we've suggested and they've made proposals along the lines of increased salary for legislative staff to make it a job that we will have more people who are staying around longer and are then able to be hired by these new members of Congress. Do a variety of things that promote bipartisanship. So for example, when there are briefings to committee staff on a particular issue area, make sure that you're inviting both Democrats and Republicans, because often they've been doing those separately for Democrats and for Republicans, but they could do more together. Increase expertise, increase specialization, and often for us, that is a series of reforms that will help the committee process become rejuvenated there. And so the fact that the Select Committee has put forward hundreds of recommendations, most of them not things that we came up with, but some of them very much in line with our research, and that more than half of those have passed through the House gives us some hope there. And then in terms of our final bucket, accountability, for voters who are uninformed, for anybody that's interested, you can go to our website, thelawmakers.org, and look up any member of Congress, how effective they are. You can click on the House or the Senate. You can click on any of those 21 different issue areas. If you want to know, I want to work on Capitol Hill next summer, and I want to work on education, who are the people who are getting a lot done on education, you click on that, you find out more, and you can look by state and so on, and it'll list from the top to the bottom who are the effective lawmakers. And once we made those data available, we're finding more and more attention and potential for accountability. Members of Congress who score high will note that in a variety of op-eds. They'll tweet about it. Newspapers will use our scores in part of their endorsements of who do we want to be future president of the United States. And members of Congress will then put that on their campaign literature, on their t-shirts, and so on, moving forward. And so there's a lot of work that we still have to do, but the research is pointing us towards some opportunities to build a better Congress, and then we're engaging with other organizations to help get the job done. For me, it's felt like really meaningful work, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share it with you. So thank you so much. Questions? Yeah. Yeah, so we don't go into how to be an effective campaigner, but we do see kind of the why are these lawmakers more foxes than hedgehogs in many cases, because our advice for almost all of them is you're not as specialized as you should be, even though there's this peak. Since almost all of them are below that peak, our advice is become more specialized, gain more expertise. But we do note, well, why are they introducing so many different issue areas? And some of it is, well, I promised to do this in my campaign. And so that's totally legit. We want democracy to work, that if you're making a promise, you actually do something about it. But as we follow that forward, a lot of times they're introducing bills that they aren't really taking seriously. So, and we can figure that out by, hey, you introduced a bill and you have no co-sponsors on it. Was that a serious effort? And some of the rest of those. So that helps a little bit. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. So I'm not sure if any of you knows how congressional office is organized. Right. So they do have a pretty substantial staff, and then they are kind of teamed up in different areas. So there's communications and there's the district staff, but we're really talking about the legislative staff. And those tend to have a legislative director and then a lot of legislative aides or assistants, different terms in different offices and so on. And when we talk to those legislative assistants, they do have a clear portfolio for themselves, right? And most of the time, those portfolios are exactly for, as you're suggesting, how are we going to vote? Because we have to know yes or no on each of the amendments and each of the issues that are going forward. And so what most members of Congress do, they definitely hire and trust their staff and have them gaining that level of expertise. But then they demand, give me a quick memo. So if you enter the Batten School, you'll get to write a lot of quick memos on why should I vote yes or no, and what are the consequences, like who's going to be upset with me for each side of that vote, and so on. So there's a big level of trust, but with reasoning attached to it and accountability there. For the ones who specialize, what I'm suggesting is, yeah, take one of your 5 legislative staffers and say, you're only going to focus on education, right? Because It's going to be more different issues that the other four are doing, but we're so invested in education that we really want to dedicate the bills that we write, all of the connections there, and so on, whereas some have education, health, and welfare as their portfolio. And so there is that degree of dedicating, parts of your team more to one area or another. Yes. Right. So when I go up and talk to people, both in the administration and on Capitol Hill, about this sort of question, right? Who has the expertise, and how can we make sure that our bills are well formulated to address public policy challenges? We do find that it is more so the administration, the presidency, as we talk about it broadly, than members of Congress along those lines. And so the question is, how can we there's two possibilities. We can try to get that information from the EPA as we're setting up environmental policy, or we can set up a general guideline. The level of arsenic in the water here should be between 0 and 5 parts per billion. EPA, you go pick the exact number and come back to us. That idea of delegating from the legislature to the executive is one that's just fascinating. I've written a little bit on it in separate projects, but the problem is we need Congress informed enough that they don't give so much discretion to the agencies that they can kind of just do whatever they want, or that the policies flip dramatically when we move from one president to the next, which we have seen in some policy areas. And so a lot of it is, how do we get that expertise from the agencies to the Congress to make better laws that are kind of then locked in? And there are some techniques there. It tends to be through some processes that are mainly, again, done in the committees, with the committees and the committee staff asking for what's called technical assistance from a variety of agencies, and they build up those relationships over time. So when the political parties go around that process of expertise to say, no, we know how to set up a big infrastructure bill or Build Back Better plan, as much as they are good ideas from their points of view, ultimately when it comes to, well, what are the details and how are we getting those right, and how can we make sure we use our expertise, we need to re-empower the committee. Lots of questions, and I'm going to neglect you all, but let's go here and then just work our way across. Yep. Yeah, it's largely two things. So one is staffers not being paid enough, and then realizing, and especially if they start to have families and so on, that, hey, I can get a lot more money if I become a lobbyist, which is the natural one, or a variety of other things that they want to do. And so I think the average age of a congressional staffer, average seniority of a congressional staffer, not age, but the time they've spent on Capitol Hill is somewhere between 2 and 3 years. So it's a quick in and out for many people. So then the question is, what can we do to have more people around who are 5 to 10 to 20 to see this as a career? And that is an important step. And so then the second reason is members of Congress don't know. I mean, they're new. I guess I need to come up with a staff. How do I get one? And who are the people that I know who know something about these policy areas? There's people who wrote my briefs for my campaigns. That's great for the expert knowledge. That's not so great for the ins and outs of who do we need to work with to build a coalition. Yes, I'll just work this way. Yes, so there are a lot of efforts to say, okay, how can we make state legislatures work better? And working better, there's a bunch of terms involved in that, but the ones that we would look for are meeting year-round, and if you're going to meet year-round, paying people enough that they can meet year-round, and There are a lot of states, and Virginia is one of them, where there's a big pushback whenever those proposals come up. And the big pushback is, well, we don't really trust those professional politicians. We trust each other. And we don't mind when somebody who looks like me and works next to me goes and works in the state legislature, but once they get there and they become professional politicians, they lose touch with the public. And so a lot are pushing back against those proposals. Unfortunately, we find that that takes away the training grounds for a member of Congress, but it also means that state legislatures, some of my other work is on how policies spread from one state to the next, and that professional state legislatures are much more likely to look at what other states have done, find the policies that work, and incorporate them in their own states. And so when there's pushback against, we don't want you to be a professional politician, the other side could be armed with, but it means we'll be better represented in Congress, and it means we'll have policies that have worked elsewhere. And those debates haven't been as vigorous as perhaps they could be moving forward. Yes. Yeah, I mean, the way that that's played out is kind of through a multi-step process. So as the Congress became more polarized, and for those of you who don't know, Congress is very polarized, and it didn't used to be that way. And so when we have data back to the 1970s, the two parties overlapped like this, and now they overlap like this, not at all. And so as that happened, each of the parties basically said, well, we want to advance our interests, and we don't want to advance the other party's interests. And what's the best way to do that? Well, some committee chairs could be all over the map, although they tend to be in their parties, but they tended to be more senior because of the nature of committee chairs. And as the parties moved apart, the most senior members still looked like the old Congress, so still looked more moderate. And so the party leaders were saying, well, we can have these moderate committee chairs coming up with the policy proposals and using their expertise, or we can look like what we want our party to look like, and kind of bypass the committees, put term limits on the committee chairs, and formulate the policies ourselves. And so the party leaders said that's the way to go, and they had enough members that said, yeah, those chairs, I don't really like them. And so they went around that process. And part of the hope was we can get rid of all of the proposals of the minority party. We can advance a coherent policy from the majority party, and it'll be exactly what our voters want, and we can control this more, and then we'll be reelected, and that'll help us establish a permanent majority. That didn't work. As we're seeing, Congress swings from Democrat control to Republican control. It's doing it again, it sounds like, if we're following the election results. And so that as a strategy isn't working. Plus we lose expertise, plus the administrative state steps in because Congress isn't doing its job. I think that's why there are some proposals afoot to say, let's rethink what we've been doing. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess the thought is, what is an expert, right? So when we were first entertaining what should Congress do to regulate the internet, it became very evident they were not experts, right? And that having some new people in who actually had experience in this area would have been very helpful. And so I wouldn't correlate it that cleanly. There are some areas where that expertise is correlated with their seniority more highly, but it doesn't tend to be as innovative in a variety of ways. And so, the issue areas where we've seen a lot of we need expertise, there's a lot of difficulty on the ins and outs of policies, are like financial services and some of the more difficult to regulate banking practices, or some of the reforms in major healthcare areas. I guess you just kind of want to think about especially if you're drawn to a policy area, and especially if you want to gain expertise so that, 10 years down the road, I'm one of the top experts in my maybe sub area, but within some bigger field. If you start to talk to people and you find out, I can gain that expertise in 5 years and be at the top of my field, that's different than I can gain it in 10 years or 20 years. And so there are some fields where I think we've really lost out, and others where, yeah, maybe more churn wouldn't be such a bad idea. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of it is this question of what's the best way to get information to voters along those lines. We as kind of, we want to maintain that we're nonpartisan and that we're not saying vote for this person and don't vote for that person. We haven't taken a strong role in campaigning at all. If we think about, okay, how would we spread the message, pick whoever you like, but here's some information, go to our website. We could do more of that, it feels like. What the strategy that we've adopted more is that where do we feel like people are getting their information? And some of it is coming from endorsements. And so we're interacting quite a bit with the media to find out, to communicate our knowledge, but also to help them understand, who's doing well and who's doing poorly in this space. And ultimately, when they're picking up on our information, it is less about us talking to the Washington Post and the New York Times, and it's more about us when we release our new scores, coming up with our top 10 lists in each issue area for both parties, for the House and Senate, and those members and their communication staff really then communicating to the media and getting that story out on their behalf. And if we really want to draw members to, or the public to our website, the number one thing we can do based on what we've seen and experienced the past 5 years is just really be mean and nasty to the people at the bottom of our list. We haven't done that at all. But when people do that, that drives lots of visits to our website. And so bashing on members of Congress is always a good strategy to draw attention, but not one that we've adopted thus far. Question for me? Yeah. So you read the Foxes Hedgehogs piece, and that leads us to a big project that we're doing right now called the Portfolios Project. Essentially, we're saying, you're a member of Congress, you could introduce bills in any of these 21 different issue areas. Why do you choose the ones that you choose? And as such, we've gathered data on the most recent 3 professions that every member of Congress had before they entered Congress, on their districts, what are the major industries in their districts, and so on, demographics in their districts, on their committee assignments, on campaign contributors, on lobbyists, and on a few other things. And essentially, we want to say, okay, for that first stage of the lawmaking process, the bills that you introduce, how much do those look like your district versus your background versus your committee assignment, and so on? And then for later stages, how do they, move around? Our working hypothesis right now is when you introduce things, it's going to be this nice mix of everything, including your district characteristics, and bills that move further along are going to look more and more like your campaign contributors and lobbyists. I'm hoping that's not right, but I'm suspecting that's right, and we'll be in a position to comment on what that means for specialization, but also for representation. So seniority is in some fields more than in others, and just given the nature of what we're studying, members of Congress, more senior tend to be older, but I don't think it has to line up quite that neatly. And we do find that people who come to Congress, I'm a physician and I'm studying health, that seniority doesn't line up, but age does, because it takes a while to be a doctor and then to gain that experience and so on. Again, I'd say in other fields, maybe less so. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, so we can find that there are systematic biases of voters, and then kind of it links into of people who run for these offices, right? So for deeper voiced, taller people of particular backgrounds, they seem to have a smoother path forward. I don't think that's going to continue to play out that way. We've seen some changes there. We've seen, for example, the best studies that I've seen say if a man and a woman run for Congress, they're equally likely to get elected. And that part of the misrepresentation is that fewer women are choosing to run for Congress. And so voters don't quite have the biases that they used to have. So thankful for that. But then that points to, well, how do we get more and more people to run who would do a good job there? And I think that's where we're trying to step in with a little bit of information of, yeah, this would be fantastic. Do it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the way I think about this is that voters, you all, care about a lot of things, right? And you should. We're saying you should also care about lawmakers who can get it done in the areas that you care about. And most of the work that we're doing actually says, yeah, voters do care about how effective their lawmakers are. They need to be informed in order for that to weigh in. But it's also saying that, does it matter enough to swamp out these other factors? And I'm not sure that it should, right? So do you want an effective person who has the opposite views of you on something that you care deeply about? No, I don't think so, probably not. But do you want among the options of people who kind of are going to advance policies that you care about, are you going to pick the effective ones over the ineffective ones? And there we actually do find some optimism in that we find that people who perform poorly in Congress are much more likely to face a primary opponent who within their party, right? So at the primary election stage, they're much more likely to face a primary opponent and one who is what's called quality. In other words, they've already run for and been elected to some office, some lower level office. And so it's tough to say, yeah, you should go across and vote for a Democrat when you're a Republican, and because they're effective or ineffective or whatever. But in the primaries, we're seeing a little more movement there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so this is more suggestive work, so I don't know exactly the answer, but the initial work that we've done in this area says it depends on whether you pick something that really is what your voters care about, right? So if you specialize in agriculture and you're from an agricultural district, they're going to say, yeah, of course you're specializing in agriculture. And if you're specializing in something that's very different from your district, you have to make a strong case for why we should deeply care about that. Now, there are some members of Congress who do that and are phenomenal, and they can make that case, or they can say, I've dedicated my agenda to three things, and they emphasize the one that they really spend time on, and then the other two that are kind of closely aligned with the district to make that case. And they can do that. But yeah, I mean, the ones that are most successful electorally have this perfect alignment between what did I do in the past? I was a farmer. What does my district care about? Agricultural issues, and I'm on the ag committee, and I do, so there is this nice alignment in many cases, and I guess we'll find out more when we do the portfolios project of how that plays out over time. Who am I missing? Oh, yeah, sorry. Didn't see. Yeah. Yeah. So we don't know the answer to your question fully yet. So we came out with our state legislative effectiveness scores about 2 years ago and are starting to do a bunch of research. One thing that's promising there is in these professional legislatures, the people who are doing a wonderful job, according to our metric, they are more likely to put themselves forward for Congress. Right? So that's nice, right? Because we found that they're good at their job and they're good in Congress and they're more likely to put themselves forward, and then voters are totally uninformed. So at that point, then they're no more or less likely to be elected, but the fact that they're putting themselves forward at a greater level works out for us. Now, within the state legislatures themselves, we don't yet have the data of like who runs again and do voters reward them and so on. I'm really skeptical that we would find anything there, just because I think people are even less informed about their state legislators than they are about their members of Congress, and especially in terms of what level of job they're doing there. But I guess we'll find out. Thanks. Awesome. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I mean, we think about this a little bit, right? So what does it mean to be extremist in today's society? Most of the people that maybe y'all could name as, yeah, that's somebody I'm frightened of because they're in the other party and they're doing maybe some things that we don't think members of Congress should do. When we look at them, they're not especially effective universally. They've chosen to do something different. So we're not too concerned about people who have views that nevertheless they can convince a majority of the other members to vote in favor of their proposals and get things done. And that's really how you get a high score, according to our metrics. And so if one has a view that's tilted away from what I want, but they're able to capture 218 votes and then win something through the Senate and get the president on board, maybe my views are out of step and theirs are not as much along those lines. We haven't seen that pattern. We're never going to step in a uniparty approach instead of a biparty approach. We don't think that's good for democracy. And so